Relative clauses. Before you watch this video, make sure you watch the video linked on the blog that gives you a lot of information about relative clauses in general and especially in English. The relative clause is used to describe a noun that was previously stated in a sentence, so it relates back to that noun. That noun is called the antecedent. The relative clause is introduced by words like which, whose, whom, that in English, and in Latin, qui, quae, quem, quam, etc. Let's look at some examples of the relative clause in English first. The boy who sold his cow for beans was foolish. So the relative clause, I've made it easy to identify. It's in the brownish font. That clause, who sold his cow for beans, tells us more about the boy. The boy came before it. The boy is the antecedent. And now the relative clause is always introduced by a pronoun. And that pronoun is called the relative pronoun, which I talked about on the last screen. So the who, which, that, whom, and it replaces the antecedent, the word that it relates back to. And then this whole clause tells us a little bit about that noun. Because you know a pronoun replaces a noun. So the noun that it is replacing, the entire clause is telling us more about. The cow that the boy sold produced much milk. Which cow? What cow are you talking about? The one that the boy sold. And what word is the antecedent? Cow. What pronoun is that? And the whole clause is that the boy sold. The boy, whose mother was angry, hid in his room. What is whose replacing? What is its antecedent? Again, boy. And whose mother was angry tells us again more about boy. So in Latin, the relative pronoun is much like an adjective. So an adjective has to have case and quantity. And I've told you also gender. Because it has to match the noun, it has to agree with the noun. Well, the pronouns in general, and the relative pronouns specifically, also, because it replaces a noun, has to have case, quantity, and gender. Okay, so there are all the forms. There's a masculine form, a feminine form, a neuter form, and then a form for all the cases, singular and plural. Okay, however, let's pause here for a second and read this second bullet. The relative pronoun will match the antecedent, and the antecedent is the noun that it replaces because it's a pronoun. It's only going to match that in quantity and gender. Okay? They have, so the antecedent and the relative pronoun, which replaced that antecedent, have to be the same number or quantity and gender. Let's erase that because now I can't read under it. Quantity and gender. Okay? However, so I already told you they have to have case because they replace a noun. But the case of the pronoun comes from how it is used in its own sentence. if it is or in its own clause rather, if it is the subject of the clause, it'll be nominative. And if it's the direct object of the clause, it'll be accusative, etc. Let me just make sure you're clear on some of these terms I've been throwing out. So a relative clause is a dependent clause. It cannot stand on its own. And as an entire clause, it is giving us information about some noun in the sentence. It relates to that noun. These relative clauses are introduced by a relative pronoun. In English, the who, which, from, who, which, that, whose, and in Latin, qui, quae, quod, and etc. as you decline it. In the antecedent, I've said this word several times. So remember, relative pronoun introduces relative clause, and they relate back to a noun. What is that noun? Well, it's the antecedent, meaning coming before. Antecedent, coming before. Here is the declension of the relative pronoun. Now, honestly, for this stage, you need to know nominative. You need to know accusative, singular, and plural. You'll need to know all of them eventually, or recognize them eventually. But for right now, you just need to know nominative and accusative. And there's a new case that I snuck in there. The GEN stands for genitive. You can ignore that entirely for now. We'll come back to that. Examples of the relative clause in Latin. Quem, qui est vir bonus laudant. Qui est vir bonus, relative clause, introduced by a relative pronoun. Okay? And remember, like I said, that relative pronoun and the relative clause. So that relative pronoun replaces the antecedent, which is quem. Remember, falling before, coming before. And then the entire clause also tells us about that antecedent. They praised the citizen who is a good man. Now, one thing I want to point out, quem is accusative. Qui is nominative. Remember, they don't have to be the same case. Qui is nominative because it is the subject of est. Quem is accusative because it is the direct object of laudant. They praise the citizen who is a good man. Vinum, quod salvius bibebat, erat optimum. Quod salvius bibebat is your relative clause introduced by quod, which is your relative pronoun. Ooh, that's ugly. Which is your relative pronoun. And it tells us more about vinum. And it replaces vinum. One thing I want to point out, vinum is nominative. It looks weird but it is something we're going to be learning soon, the gender. So this is a new gender that I think I've hinted at. It's neuter, and the endings are slightly different. And so quod is neuter and singular. It's also nominative. That's just by chance. So the wine which Salvius was drinking was very good. Oh, quod is actually accusative, excuse me. Some more examples of the relative clause. Qui rex, qui sceptrum tenebat, in atrio sedebat. The relative clause, qui sceptrum tenebat, introduced by qui, referring back to rex, so it's masculine, singular. The king, who was holding the scepter, was sitting in the atrium. So it tells us more about which king, the one who's holding the scepter, because it relates back to that. Ancillae quae dominum temebant e villa festina verunt. Relative clause. Quae dominum temebant, referring back to ancillae, and quae is replacing ancillae. It is the antecedent. And it means the slave girls who were afraid of the master hurried out of the house. Okay, so there are more exercises in your book. If you need more help, you can do those exercises, translate. But that's it. And make sure you do listen to the other video that is on the blog. All right, thanks.